The rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows of their Seattle home was a steady, rhythmic drumming, a perfect acoustic backdrop to what was supposed to be a celebratory evening. But beneath the polished surface of the dining table, Daniel noticed the subtle, lingering glance his wife exchanged with her phone screen, a screen she had kept face down all night. It was the kind of silent fracture that didn't destroy a marriage in an explosive instant, but bled it dry over countless quiet moments. If you are drawn to the quiet devastation of secrets and the heavy price of starting over, stay with me. There are far more shadows behind these closed doors. If you want to walk through them, don't leave the channel just yet. The kitchen smelled of roasted rosemary, brown butter, and the faint, metallic scent of ozone from the storm brewing over Lake Washington. Daniel stood perfectly still over the expansive marble island, a silver cake knife hovering just above the surface of a dark chocolate tart. From the dining room, the muffled sounds of laughter drifted through the open archway. It was a sophisticated sound, the kind of laughter practiced in boardrooms and at charity galas. Tonight was Olivia's night. She had just been named senior partner at Vanguard PR, one of Seattle's most ruthless communications firms. Daniel had spent the entire weekend preparing for this dinner party, playing the role of the supportive, grounded husband, the charming public school teacher who kept the high-flying executive anchored to reality. He set the knife down. The handle made a soft clink against the marble. On the far end of the counter, partially obscured by a bowl of lemons, Olivia's backup iPad lit up. She rarely used it, usually leaving it plugged in to control the house's smart audio system. But tonight, the screen glowed with a harsh white light, illuminating the dark corner of the kitchen. Daniel didn't mean to look. He was merely reaching for a towel to wipe his hands. But the notification banner was large, stark, and impossible to ignore against the lock screen. Mark, the hotel bar was too crowded anyway. Suite 402 is better. Did you tell the teacher you were working late again tomorrow? The words hung in the air, suspended in the quiet hum of the refrigerator. Daniel felt a sudden, profound drop in his chest, as if the floorboards had simply vanished beneath his feet. The sensation wasn't hot. It wasn't the fiery, blinding rage he had read about in novels or seen in movies. It was a creeping, paralyzing cold. It started in his fingertips and rushed straight to his lungs, stealing his breath. He stepped closer to the screen. His hand trembled slightly as he hovered his index finger over the glass, not touching it, just tracing the outline of the words. Suite 402. The teacher. Mark. Mark was Vanguard's biggest client, a venture capitalist with a reputation for aggressive takeovers and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He was sitting in the dining room right now, drinking the Pinot Noir Daniel had carefully selected, laughing at a joke someone had just made. Daniel unlocked the iPad. Olivia hadn't bothered to change the passcode from their wedding anniversary. The device was synced to her phone. He opened the messaging app. He didn't read deeply. He didn't need to read the graphic details or scroll through months of history. The fragments he caught in a 5-second skim were enough to dismantle his entire reality. I can't stop thinking about yesterday. Daniel is so oblivious, it's almost sad. I need you. Not this domestic prison. A domestic prison. Daniel looked up from the screen, his eyes focusing on the archway that led to the dining room. Through the gap, he could see Olivia. She was wearing a deep emerald silk dress that clung perfectly to her frame. Her dark hair swept over one shoulder. She was leaning back in her chair, a crystal wine glass held loosely in her manicured hand, her head thrown back in genuine, uninhibited laughter. Mark sat directly across from her. As Olivia laughed, Mark's eyes remained fixed heavily on her, entirely ignoring the person speaking beside him. It was a look of possession, an intimate, knowing gaze that existed entirely outside the boundaries of a professional relationship. And Olivia, in a fraction of a second, met his eyes and offered a microscopic, secret smile before turning her attention back to the table. In the kitchen, the silence roared in Daniel's ears. 7 years of marriage. 7 years of grading papers late into the night so he could be present for her morning anxieties. 7 years of postponing his own dream of building an educational software platform because they needed the stability of his state benefits while she took risks to climb the corporate ladder. He had thought they were building a life together. He realized now he had only been building a ladder for her to climb away from him. A lesser man might have picked up the heavy cast iron skillet resting on the stove. A lesser man might have marched into the dining room, flipped the table, and screamed until his throat bled, demanding explanations, demanding justice, demanding to know why. But Daniel was a man built on patience. His profession required him to observe, to understand human behavior, to wait. The coldness in his veins began to solidify into something much harder, much more dangerous than anger. It crystallized into absolute clarity. There was no explanation that could unwrite those messages. There was no apology that could erase the look Mark had just given his wife in his own home. The marriage was already a corpse. Daniel was simply the last one to realize it had stopped breathing. He carefully locked the iPad screen and placed it exactly where he had found it. He picked up the silver knife. His hands were no longer shaking. He sliced the dark chocolate tart with mathematical precision, wiping the blade clean after every single cut to ensure the edges were perfect. He arranged the slices on a porcelain serving platter, added a sprig of fresh mint to each plate, and picked up the tray. As Daniel walked through the archway and into the warm, glowing light of the dining room, Olivia looked up at him. Her eyes crinkled with what looked perfectly like love. "Oh, you're an angel, Dan," she said, her voice dripping with affection as she reached out to touch his arm. "I was just telling Mark how I couldn't survive this promotion without you holding down the fort." Daniel looked down at her hand resting on his sleeve. Then he looked at Mark, offering the venture capitalist a calm, perfectly polite smile. "It's my pleasure," Daniel said, his voice smooth, betraying absolutely nothing. "Enjoy it. It's the last one I'll be making." No one caught the double meaning. They just laughed, digging their forks into the rich chocolate. Daniel stood back, watching his wife eat, knowing with absolute, terrifying certainty that by the time the sun rose over the Seattle skyline, he would be gone. The emotional goal of this scene is to capture the chilling precision of a man dismantling his marriage in absolute silence. The immediate conflict is entirely internal as Daniel, leaving his sleeping wife Olivia, faces the profound dilemma of walking away from his established life to preserve his dignity. Set in the dead of night in their Seattle home, the stakes are irreversible. By leaving only a signed divorce petition and his wedding ring, Daniel severs their bond completely, choosing the terrifying unknown over a comfortable lie. The last of the guests departed just after midnight, taking the artificial warmth of the dinner party with them. The front door clicked shut, the deadbolt sliding into place with a heavy, metallic finality. Olivia had kicked off her heels the moment Mark's Blacktown car pulled out of the driveway. She poured herself a final, heavy measure of leftover Pinot Noir, humming a low, satisfied tune as she drifted up the hardwood stairs. She didn't ask Daniel to come to bed. She didn't notice the mechanical stiffness in his posture as he loaded the dishwasher. She was already miles away, floating on the high of her own ambition and the secret thrill of her hidden life. Daniel waited until the water stopped running in the master bathroom. He waited until the soft, rhythmic sound of Olivia's breathing settled into the deep cadence of a wine-induced sleep. Only then did the performance end. He stood in the center of the kitchen, the silence of the house pressing against his eardrums. The dishwasher hummed a low, vibrating drone. Outside, the Seattle rain had intensified, lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows, blurring the distant, glittering lights of the city skyline. It was the same view he had saved for years to afford, a testament to their shared success. Now, it looked like a wall of static. Moving with the quiet efficiency of a ghost, Daniel walked into his small home office. He booted up his desktop computer, the screen casting a pale blue glow across his face. His keystrokes were deliberate, echoing softly in the dark room. It took less than 15 minutes to locate the standard Washington state petition for dissolution of marriage. The printer hummed to life, spitting out the crisp white pages that would officially reduce 7 years of shared history to legal jargon and blank signature lines. He filled out his sections in a steady, unhurried script. He didn't ask for the house. He didn't ask for half of her Vanguard stock options or the joint savings account they had built. He wanted nothing that carried the taint of her deception. When he reached the bottom of the final page, he signed his name. The ink bled slightly into the paper. It was done. Daniel retrieved a single, worn leather duffel bag from the hall closet. He bypassed the master bedroom entirely, opting instead for the guest room, where he kept a few changes of casual clothes. He packed practically: heavy sweaters, denim, a pair of sturdy boots, his laptop, and the external hard drive containing the chaotic, unfinished code for the educational software he had been building in his spare time. It was the only piece of his future he intended to take with him. He walked back out to the kitchen island. The marble was spotless, wiped clean of the dinner party's remnants. He placed the signed divorce petition in the dead center of the counter. Next to it, he set his house keys. Finally, Daniel looked down at his left hand. The gold band caught the dim light of the range hood. It felt suddenly heavy, an iron shackle rather than a symbol of devotion. He slipped it off his finger. The metal slid over his knuckle with chilling ease. He placed the ring meticulously on top of the divorce papers. He didn't leave a dramatic letter. He didn't leave the iPad open to Mark's messages. Olivia would know exactly why he was gone the moment she saw the ring. There was a profound, devastating power in the absence of an explanation. She had stolen his reality, and in return, he was denying her the closure of an argument. Daniel swung the duffel bag over his shoulder. The weight of it settled against his collarbone, grounding him. He opened the front door, stepping out into the biting chill of the Pacific Northwest night. The rain instantly soaked through his jacket, but he didn't pull up his collar. The immediate conflict shifts to Daniel's internal battle against despair and the external pressures of building a technology startup from scratch in the cutthroat environment of Silicon Valley. Facing the dilemma of either succumbing to his trauma or forging a completely new identity, the stakes are his sanity and his future. Failure means the betrayal truly destroyed him. Set across 5 exhausting years in California, Daniel operates under the heavy shadow of his past, severing all ties to his former life in Seattle and his marriage to Olivia, gradually healing through the sheer force of creation. The California sun was harsh, a blinding contrast to the perpetual gray drizzle of Seattle, but Daniel rarely saw it. For the first 2 years, his world shrank to the dimensions of a 300-square-foot studio apartment in San Jose. It smelled constantly of stale black coffee, overheated processors, and the ozone scent of a window AC unit fighting a losing battle against the summer heat. He had arrived with a duffel bag and a fractured sense of self. The silence that followed his departure from Olivia had been absolute. No panicked phone calls, no desperate emails asking for an explanation. When the finalized divorce papers arrived in the mail 6 months later, signed in her sharp, elegant cursive, they felt like an epitaph to a man who no longer existed. He filed them away in a cheap cardboard box and turned back to his monitors. Work became his anesthetic. The educational software platform he had dreamed of building while grading high school history essays was no longer a hobby. It was his sole tether to sanity. He coded until his vision blurred, built pitch decks until his fingers cramped, and slept in 2-hour increments on a mattress that lay directly on the hardwood floor. The trauma of betrayal did not vanish in a cinematic epiphany. It was a slow, agonizing exorcism. Sometimes, he would be standing in the fluorescent aisle of a grocery store at 2 a.m, holding a carton of milk, and a phantom memory of Olivia's laugh or the clinking of her wine glass would hit him so hard his knees would weaken. But every time the ghost of his past life threatened to drag him under, he poured another cup of coffee and wrote another 1,000 lines of code. By year 3, the tide began to turn. His platform, designed to democratize advanced learning resources for underfunded public schools, caught the attention of an angel investor who valued substance over Silicon Valley flash. The studio apartment was replaced by a modest office in Palo Alto. The team grew from 1 exhausted ex-teacher to a dozen dedicated engineers. Daniel changed, too. The soft-spoken, accommodating man who had baked chocolate tarts for his wife's arrogant clients was gone. In his place stood a CEO who commanded boardrooms with a quiet, impenetrable authority. He wore simple, tailored dark clothes. He spoke deliberately, never wasting words, and he looked people directly in the eye, holding their gaze with a calm intensity that seasoned venture capitalists found unnerving. He had learned the hard way what happened when you looked away. It was during the quiet success of year 4 that the sharp edges of his isolation finally began to soften. Seeking a brief respite from the relentless glare of screens, Daniel walked into an independent art gallery in San Francisco on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. The quiet atmosphere reminded him of an empty classroom. He stood for a long time in front of a sprawling, melancholic landscape painting, lost in the heavy texture of the gray clouds. Most people walk right past that one, a voice said softly. Daniel turned. Clara stood a few feet away, holding a clipboard against her chest. She wasn't draped in the aggressive silk and designer labels that Olivia had favored. Clara wore a simple charcoal turtleneck, her dark hair tied back with a wooden pin. Her eyes, intelligent and incredibly warm, met his without a hint of pretense or calculation. She didn't look at him like a stepping stone. She looked at him like a person. It looks like it's about to storm, Daniel replied, his voice rough from disuse outside of office walls. Or, Clara countered gently, tilting her head, like the storm just passed, and the ground is finally absorbing the water. For the first time in nearly half a decade, the persistent, hollow ache in Daniel's chest ceased its thrumming. The wilderness had been vast, cold, and desperately lonely. But as he stood there, engaging in a quiet conversation about brushstrokes and light with a woman who felt impossibly grounded, Daniel realized the punishing journey was coming to an end. He had not just survived the burning of his old life. He had forged a foundation out of the ashes, strong enough to hold something real. The emotional goal of this act is to depict Daniel's quiet, unbothered re-entry into the city that once broke him. The immediate conflict is atmospheric, as Daniel confronts the ghosts of Seattle not with anger, but with complete emotional detachment. The dilemma involves navigating the high society corporate circles without letting the shadows of his past trauma resurface. The stakes are his hard-won peace. He must prove to himself that his success is about his future with Clara, not a revenge tour against Olivia. Set in a gleaming new downtown high-rise, Daniel establishes his empire, standing as a man utterly unrecognizable from the one who fled 5 years ago. The Seattle skyline had not changed, but the man observing it from the 42nd floor of the Columbia Center had. Daniel stood near the floor-to-ceiling glass, his hands resting easily in the pockets of a charcoal bespoke suit that draped perfectly over his shoulders. Below him, the city was a sprawling grid of gray steel, wet concrete, and the relentless, creeping fog rolling in from Elliott Bay. It was the exact same view that used to make him feel small, a struggling public servant drowning in a city built for titans. Now he was leasing the entire floor. The architects can have the open concept layout finished by the end of the quarter. A nervous voice echoed in the cavernous, empty office space. It was the lead commercial broker, a man who had been sweating profusely since Daniel walked out of the elevator. And of course, we can ensure the private elevator banks are restricted exclusively to your executive team. Daniel turned slowly. He didn't speak immediately. He had learned the terrifying power of a pause during his grueling years navigating Silicon Valley boardrooms. The broker swallowed hard, adjusting his tie under the heavy weight of the silence. The timeline is acceptable, Daniel said, his voice a low, even baritone that commanded the room without raising a decibel. But I want the east-facing conference rooms expanded. My developers need natural light, even if it's just Seattle gray. Absolutely, sir. Right away. Daniel nodded, dismissing the man with a subtle shift of his posture. As the broker scurried toward the elevators, a soft pair of footsteps approached from the opposite end of the raw concrete floor. Clara stepped into his peripheral vision, carrying 2 steaming paper cups. She was dressed in an elegant, tailored camel coat, her dark hair catching the muted daylight. She handed him a cup, the rich scent of dark roast coffee and cardamom instantly cutting through the sterile smell of fresh paint and industrial carpet. "You're terrifying when you do that, you know," Clara said, a warm, private smile playing on her lips. Do what? Daniel took a slow sip, his shoulders relaxing a fraction. The silence, she replied, stepping closer until her arm brushed his. You let them fill the void with their own panic. It's very effective, but I remember a time when you told me you used to apologize if someone bumped into you on the sidewalk. Daniel looked down at his wife. The gold band on his left hand, a new ring, a different metal, a different life, caught the pale light. That man didn't survive, he said quietly. It wasn't a lament. It was a simple statement of fact. They turned back to the window. Returning to Seattle to open the secondary headquarters for his educational technology platform hadn't been a decision driven by spite. The city was a major tech hub. It made perfect logistical sense for expansion. Yet, a small, cynical part of him had wondered if crossing the city limits would trigger a panic attack, if the ghost of his ruined marriage would be waiting for him at the airport baggage claim. Instead, he felt nothing but a profound, steady calm. The city where he had bled out on his own kitchen floor was now just a coordinate on a map. The Hospital Foundation Charity Gala is on Friday, Clara mentioned softly, blowing on her coffee. Our PR team strongly advised attending. It's the formal introduction to the city's philanthropic board. We need to establish a local presence for the company's nonprofit wing. Daniel closed his eyes for a brief second. A high society gala. The exact kind of velvet-roped, champagne-soaked environment where Olivia had thrived. The environment that had funded Mark's venture capital firm. They were swimming in the same small pond now, not as prey, but as the apex predator. Then we'll go, Daniel said, opening his eyes and taking in the sweeping view of the city that used to belong to his ex-wife. He felt Clara's hand slide into his, her thumb tracing the smooth edge of his wedding band. We have nothing to hide from. The rain continued to beat heavily against the glass, a chaotic storm raging outside. But inside, standing beside the woman who had helped him rebuild his soul, Daniel was the eye of the hurricane, perfectly still and entirely untouchable. The emotional goal of this scene is to capture the suffocating weight of regret and the stark contrast between a curated illusion and genuine peace. The immediate conflict is entirely internal for Olivia, as she struggles to maintain her flawless societal facade while crumbling under Mark's escalating financial paranoia and emotional neglect. The stakes are her remaining sanity and public dignity. Reacting to the ghost of her past could shatter the fragile glass house she now lives in. Set in the opulent, overcrowded ballroom of a Seattle charity gala, Olivia's miserable reality collides violently with the sudden, shocking sight of Daniel, radiant, unrecognizable, and utterly unbothered by the world she sacrificed everything to inhabit. The crystal chandelier suspended above the grand ballroom of the Fairmont Olympic Hotel fractured the light into 1,000 sharp, blinding splinters. Below it, Seattle's elite moved in a slow, choreographed waltz of silk, diamonds, and calculated whispers. Olivia stood near a towering arrangement of white orchids, the heavy scent of the flowers doing nothing to mask the sharp, metallic tang of gin on her husband's breath. Mark's fingers were wrapped around her waist, his grip tight enough to bruise through the delicate fabric of her designer gown. He was laughing loudly at a joke made by a commercial real estate developer, but the sound was entirely hollow. Behind the aggressive charm and the tailored tuxedo, Mark was unraveling. The venture capital firm he boasted about was quietly hemorrhaging money. For 3 months, Olivia had been finding past due notices from private banks buried under his heavy mahogany desk. His temper, once confined to brief flashes of irritation, had metastasized into a constant, simmering rage. The lavish lifestyle she had traded her marriage for had become a gilded, suffocating cage, and she was terrified the door was about to lock permanently. "Keep smiling, Olivia," Mark muttered under his breath, leaning in close as the developer turned away to greet someone else. His teeth were bared in a perfect, rigid grimace. "The SEC auditors have been making calls. If you look like a panicked wife, these vultures will smell the blood in the water. I need a drink." He released her abruptly, not waiting for a response, and vanished into the dense crowd toward the open bar. Left alone by the floral arrangement, Olivia let her rigid posture drop by a fraction of an inch. She brought a flute of lukewarm champagne to her lips, the crystal clicking softly against her teeth. She felt entirely hollow. She closed her eyes for a brief second, the chaotic noise of the ballroom washing over her. Clinking glass, practiced laughter, the soft jazz of the string quartet. It was the exact life she had dreamed of when she was sitting across from Daniel at their cramped kitchen island, feeling suffocated by his contentment with a teacher's salary. She opened her eyes and let her gaze drift aimlessly across the sea of tuxedos and evening gowns. Then, her breath caught. 50 feet away, standing near the arched entryways to the private terrace, was a man. He was in profile, listening intently to the city's most notoriously difficult tech investor. He was dressed in a bespoke midnight blue tuxedo that fit with devastating precision. His posture was relaxed, his shoulders broad and unburdened, radiating a quiet, gravitational authority that caused the wealthy men around him to lean in closer just to catch his words. Olivia's heart executed a violent, painful stutter against her ribs. It couldn't be. The lighting was playing tricks. The man shifted his weight, turning slightly toward the center of the room to accept a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter. It was Daniel. The champagne flute in Olivia's hand trembled so violently that a drop of the pale liquid spilled over the rim, landing like a tear on her wrist. The man standing across the room bore the same facial architecture as the husband she had abandoned in the dead of night 5 years ago, but the essence of him was entirely eradicated. The soft, accommodating public school teacher was gone. This man possessed a hardened, striking elegance. He looked powerful. He looked incredibly, terrifyingly wealthy. But what struck Olivia with the force of a physical blow, what made her throat close up and her eyes burn with sudden, inexplicable tears, was his expression. Daniel smiled at something the investor said. It was a genuine, easy smile that reached his eyes, crinkling the corners. It was a look of complete, unadulterated peace. He was not looking around the room for validation. He was not gripping a glass with white-knuckled desperation like Mark. He was simply existing, completely unbothered by the glittering, toxic ecosystem Olivia was currently drowning in. She took a panicked half-step backward, her heel catching on the hem of her gown. She wanted to look away. She needed to look away before Mark returned, before the illusion shattered completely. But she was paralyzed, a prisoner in her own ruined choices, forced to watch the man she had discarded stand triumphantly at the absolute summit of the world she had broken them both to reach. The emotional goal of this scene is the agonizing collision between a meticulously curated lie and undeniable, devastating reality. The immediate conflict erupts when Mark, desperate for a financial lifeline, unknowingly forces Olivia to face her billionaire ex-husband, Daniel, in front of Seattle's elite. Olivia's dilemma is agonizing. She must smile through the public introduction to Daniel's new wife, Clara, without letting her shattering regret expose her crumbling current marriage. The stakes are absolute social and psychological ruin for Olivia, as she realizes she traded a man of profound substance for a hollow, abusive fraud, right in the opulent ballroom of the Fairmont Olympic Hotel. The string quartet shifted into a somber, sweeping waltz that felt entirely out of place against the frantic beating of Olivia's heart. She remained frozen by the orchid arrangement, her knuckles white around the crystal stem of her champagne flute. Across the room, Daniel was still deep in conversation, utterly oblivious to the earthquake his mere presence had triggered within her. Before Olivia could force her paralyzed legs to move toward the exit, a heavy hand clamped down on her bare shoulder. "There you are," Mark hissed, his breath hot and carrying the sharp, botanical sting of his third gin martini. His grip was tight, urgent. "Stop standing around like a decorative vase. We have work to do." Olivia blinked, her vision swimming in the harsh glare of the chandeliers. "Mark, I don't feel well. The room is too warm. I need to get my coat." "You are not leaving," Mark snapped, his voice a low, terrifying growl disguised under a stiff, public smile. He yanked her closer, his fingers digging into her collarbone. Do you see that man over there? The one talking to Harrison? That's the founder of the new educational tech conglomerate moving into the Columbia Center. They're saying his firm is heavily liquid. If I can get 10 minutes with him, it could bridge our capital gap before the auditors close in. Olivia felt the blood drain entirely from her face. No. Mark, please, walk, he commanded, linking his arm through hers in a vice grip that looked to the rest of the room like a gesture of marital devotion. He dragged her forward. The 50 feet across the ballroom felt like a march to the executioner's block. The air grew thinner with every step. Olivia stared at the floor, watching the intricate patterns of the Persian rug blur together, praying to a god she hadn't spoken to in years that the floorboards would simply open and swallow her whole. "Excuse me, Harrison." Mark's voice boomed with practiced, artificial warmth as they reached the edge of the circle. "I don't believe I've had the pleasure of meeting our city's newest visionary." The tech investor stepped aside. Daniel turned slowly. The silence that fell between the three of them was absolute, a vacuum that sucked the oxygen straight out of Olivia's lungs. Daniel's dark eyes landed on Mark first, registering the aggressive posture and the desperate, sweating charm. Then, his gaze shifted slightly, settling on Olivia. There was no shock. There was no flash of old anger, no residual pain, no triumphant sneer. There was only a calm, chillingly polite acknowledgement, as if he were looking at a vaguely familiar stranger he had once bumped into at a coffee shop. "I'm Mark Vance, managing partner at Vance Capital," Mark said, entirely oblivious to the suffocating tension, extending a hand. "And this is my wife, Olivia." Daniel looked at the extended hand for a fraction of a second before taking it. His grip was firm, unhurried. "Daniel, it's a pleasure." He didn't say his last name. He didn't need to. "Olivia, darling, say hello," Mark prompted, his fingers digging into her ribs as a silent warning. Olivia's lips parted, but her throat was filled with ash. She looked into the eyes of the man whose heart she had methodically broken, the man for whom she had left a signed piece of paper in the dead of night. "Hello," she managed to whisper, the words scraping painfully against her vocal cords. "It is nice to see you," Daniel said. The pitch of his voice was perfectly even, flawlessly cordial. It was the most terrifying sound Olivia had ever heard. Before Mark could launch into his desperate elevator pitch, a soft rustle of silk announced a new presence. Clara stepped to Daniel's side, slipping her hand naturally into the crook of his arm. She looked radiant, her intelligent eyes scanning the small group with genuine warmth. Daniel's entire demeanor shifted. The professional, icy distance melted away, replaced by a quiet, grounded affection that Olivia recognized with a violent pang of grief. It was the look he used to give her before the late nights and the lies had eroded it away. "Mark, Olivia," Daniel said, his voice softening as he looked down at the woman beside him. "Allow me to introduce my wife, Clara." Clara smiled, extending her hand. "It's lovely to meet you both. Daniel has told me so much about the interesting dynamics of the corporate circles here." Olivia stared at Clara's hand, the delicate gold band resting comfortably on her finger. The ballroom around her dissolved into static. The devastating reality crashed down upon her with the weight of a collapsing building. Daniel hadn't just survived her betrayal. He had transcended it. He had built a fortress of genuine love and success, and Olivia was forever locked outside in the cold, tethered to a sinking ship of her own making. The emotional goal of this scene is to illustrate the agonizing desperation of a woman drowning in her own consequences. The immediate conflict lies in Olivia crossing a massive, silent boundary, drafting an email to Daniel under the guise of professional PR consulting. Her dilemma is a toxic mix of pride and survival. Reaching out to the ex-husband she betrayed is deeply humiliating, but Mark's impending financial collapse leaves her with no other lifeline. Set in her sleek but suffocating Vanguard PR office, the stakes are her last shred of dignity. If Daniel ignores or rejects her, she has truly hit rock bottom with nowhere left to hide. The rain had not stopped for 3 days, casting a perpetual, bruised twilight over the Vanguard PR offices. Olivia sat alone behind her polished glass desk, the heavy frosted door shut against the muted hum of the agency floor. On her secondary monitor, a news ticker from an independent financial blog refreshed automatically. Vance Capital under SEC scrutiny, rumors of insolvency swirl. The headline was small, buried under broader tech acquisition news, but in her insular world, it was a deafening siren. Mark had not come home in 2 days. His phone went straight to a sterile voicemail, and the platinum joint credit cards they shared had been quietly declined at a downtown restaurant the previous afternoon. The gilded cage had not just locked, it was rapidly running out of oxygen. Olivia's primary monitor displayed something entirely different. It was the sleek, minimalist landing page of Daniel's educational tech firm. The corporate directory listed only a generic administrative contact, likely filtered by 3 levels of assistance. But she knew him. She knew the cadence of his logic, the way he meticulously organized his digital life. She opened her encrypted mail client and typed in a direct variation. His first initial, his last name, followed by the company domain. Her hands hovered over the keyboard. The ergonomic curves of the keys felt suddenly foreign, freezing against her perfectly manicured fingertips. Daniel, I need help. Mark is under investigation, and we are losing everything. Please. She stared at the stark, desperate words. They were pathetic. They were the words of a victim, and she had never allowed herself to be a victim, even when she was the sole architect of her own disaster. Her pride, battered and bleeding as it was, flared. She highlighted the text and hit delete. The cursor blinked, a rhythmic, mocking pulse against the glaring white background. She started again, her posture stiffening. Daniel, it was lovely to see you and Clara at the gala. I am writing strictly in a professional capacity. Vanguard PR specializes in crisis management and corporate integration for expanding tech firms establishing themselves in the Seattle market. Given your new headquarters, I believe our agency could offer significant strategic value. I would appreciate the opportunity to discuss this over coffee. It was a lie wrapped in corporate synergy. It was the exact kind of sterile, calculated language she used to manipulate public narratives for failing politicians and corrupt executives. But beneath the polished jargon, it was a distress flare. It was a thinly veiled plea for a meeting, a fabricated reason to sit in the same room with the only man she knew who possessed the power, the capital, and the unshakable morality to throw her a life preserver. She needed him to remember the 7 years before the betrayal. She needed him to remember the cramped apartment, the late-night conversations, the woman he used to look at as if she were the center of his gravity. If she could just get him to a neutral space, away from the glittering ballroom and the intimidating presence of his new wife, she could perhaps access the soft, forgiving public school teacher she had left behind. Her index finger rested heavily on the mouse. The click of the button sounded as loud as a fractured bone in the quiet office. The email vanished from her drafts and appeared in her sent folder. Olivia pushed her chair back, her breathing shallow and fast. She picked up her cold cup of espresso, her hand trembling so noticeably that dark ripples formed on the surface of the liquid. She had just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. She was begging her billionaire ex-husband for salvation from the ruin caused by the man she had replaced him with. She turned her chair to face the window, watching the raindrops blur the taillights on the freeway below. The silence in the office was absolute. She waited for the familiar ping of an incoming message. She waited as the sky outside turned a deeper, more unforgiving shade of gray, the terrifying realization slowly sinking into her bones that the man she had just emailed might no longer exist. The emotional goal of this scene is to deliver a quiet, devastating finality. The immediate conflict centers on Olivia's desperate attempt to leverage their shared past for a professional lifeline, meeting Daniel at a high-end Seattle coffee shop. Her dilemma is exposing her vulnerability to a man she deeply wounded, risking complete rejection. The stakes are her remaining pride and survival. When Daniel establishes a chillingly polite, impenetrable boundary, treating her as nothing more than a liability, Olivia is forced to realize that the man who loved her is entirely dead, leaving her utterly isolated in her impending ruin. The espresso machine hissed, a sharp, violent burst of steam that made Olivia flinch in the corner booth. She sat in the back of an artisanal roastery in South Lake Union, the kind of aggressively minimalist cafe where the concrete walls amplified every scraping chair and low conversation. Outside, the rain washed over the large pane glass in relentless sheets. Her black Americano sat untouched, a cold, dark mirror reflecting the pale exhaustion in her face. She checked her phone. 2:58 p.m. She had spent 2 hours perfecting her appearance, opting for a structured charcoal blazer and minimal makeup, a carefully calibrated armor designed to project authority and subtle remorse. At precisely 3 p.m., the heavy glass door swung open. Daniel stepped inside, bringing a rush of damp, freezing air with him. He wore a dark, tailored cashmere overcoat over a simple slate gray sweater. He paused near the entrance, his eyes scanning the tables with the casual, unbothered efficiency of a man looking for a business associate. When his gaze landed on her, there was no flicker of hesitation, no tightening of the jaw. He simply walked over, the wet soles of his leather shoes silent against the polished concrete. He did not sit down immediately. He unbuttoned his overcoat but kept it on, a clear, unspoken signal that he had no intention of staying long. When he finally slid into the leather booth opposite her, he kept his hands folded on the table. The gold band on his left hand caught the dim overhead light. "You have 15 minutes, Olivia," Daniel said. His voice was a calm, low baritone, devoid of anger or warmth. It was the exact tone an executive used to address an underperforming vendor. Olivia swallowed the sharp lump of panic rising in her throat. She leaned forward slightly, forcing the corporate mask onto her face. "Daniel, thank you for coming. I know your schedule is incredibly demanding right now. Vanguard PR has been analyzing your expansion into the Seattle market, and we believe Vanguard stock dropped 14% this morning." Daniel interrupted gently. He didn't raise his voice, but the words sliced through the air with surgical precision. "Mark's venture capital firm is expected to be formally indicted by the SEC before Friday. Several of your leading partners have already tendered their resignations." The air vanished from Olivia's lungs. The noise of the cafe, the grinding beans, the chatter, the jazz music, faded into a high-pitched ringing in her ears. He knew. Of course, he knew. He was swimming in the highest echelons of the city's financial currents. He likely knew about Mark's collapse before the auditors did. "You aren't here to pitch a crisis management strategy," Daniel continued, his dark eyes locked onto hers with a chilling, clinical detachment. "You are here to ask for a bailout." The facade shattered completely. The polished PR executive vanished, leaving behind a terrified, cornered woman. Olivia's hands began to tremble so violently she had to press them flat against the wooden table. "Daniel, please," she whispered, her voice cracking, dropping the professional pretense entirely. "I have nothing. The bank accounts are frozen. The house is leveraged. Mark is going to prison, and he's dragging me down with him. I made a mistake. A terrible, unforgivable mistake. But we used to." She reached across the small table, her fingers stretching toward his folded hands. It was an instinctive, desperate plea for the man who used to bake her tarts and grade papers while she slept. Daniel withdrew his hands before she could make contact. The movement was not jerky or repulsed. It was smooth, deliberate, and entirely final. He leaned back against the leather booth, putting physical distance between them. "You didn't make a mistake, Olivia," he said softly, the absolute lack of emotion in his voice more devastating than any scream could ever be. "You made a series of calculated, deliberate choices. You chose Mark. You chose the life he offered. I am merely the man who signed the paperwork allowing you to have it." He stood up, adjusting the lapels of his overcoat. He looked down at her, not with hatred, but with a profound, terrifying indifference. "My assistant scheduled this meeting because I wanted to deliver this message in person to ensure there is no misinterpretation," Daniel stated, his tone chillingly polite. "My wife and I are building a life in this city. My company is establishing its future here. You are a liability to both. Do not email my office again. Do not approach Clara." If you attempt to contact us in any capacity, my legal team will handle the correspondence." Olivia sat paralyzed, tears finally spilling over her lashes, tracing hot, pathetic lines down her pale cheeks. "Daniel." "Goodbye, Olivia." He turned and walked toward the exit, pushing open the heavy glass door and stepping out into the freezing Seattle rain. He didn't look back. Olivia remained entirely still in the crowded, noisy cafe, staring at the empty space across the table, finally understanding the true, agonizing weight of absolute zero. The emotional goal of this act is to portray the visceral, suffocating reality of a complete societal and personal downfall. The immediate conflict is external and brutal, as Mark's fraudulent financial empire is forcibly dismantled by federal authorities, shattering the gilded cage Olivia sacrificed her first marriage to build. Her dilemma is entirely gone. The choices have already been made, and she is left with the paralyzing stakes of absolute financial ruin and public humiliation. Set in their opulent Seattle mansion during the early hours of the morning, Olivia is forced to stand silently as the superficial life she chose over Daniel is systematically boxed away as criminal evidence. The dawn did not break over Lake Washington so much as it bled through the heavy, oppressive cloud cover, casting a sickly, bruised purple light across the master bedroom. Olivia was already awake. She had been staring at the vaulted ceiling for hours, listening to the hollow, irregular rhythm of Mark pacing the floorboards in the study below. The illusion finally shattered at 6:15 a.m. There was no polite ringing of the doorbell. It was a heavy, authoritative pounding that reverberated through the massive, silent house like a physical blow. Before Olivia could even push the silk duvet off her legs, the sound of heavy boots echoed in the marble foyer. She pulled a cashmere robe tightly around her shoulders, her hands trembling so violently she could barely tie the belt, and walked out to the sweeping glass-paneled staircase. The scene below was terrifying in its clinical efficiency. Men and women in dark windbreakers bearing the bright yellow letters of the FBI and the SEC had flooded the entryway. The soft, ambient lighting of the house was violently overwhelmed by the sweeping, chaotic flashes of red and blue strobes cutting through the morning fog outside the front doors. Mark was backed against the mahogany console table. The aggressive, untouchable venture capitalist who had commanded ballrooms and terrified boardrooms was entirely gone. In his place was a pale, sweating, profoundly small man. His hands were shaking as an agent read him his rights, the metallic click of handcuffs sounding unnervingly loud against the backdrop of the quiet mansion. He did not look up at Olivia. He did not call her name. He simply stared at the floor, completely consumed by his own ruin. Olivia remained frozen on the landing, a ghost haunting her own life. Agents began moving past her, their expressions devoid of pity or malice. They were just doing a job. They carried flat cardboard boxes, systematically dismantling the life she had traded her soul to acquire. They entered Mark's study, pulling files from the heavy desk. Two agents walked into the dining room, cataloging the silver and the art on the walls. A female agent approached the landing, holding a clipboard. "Mrs. Vance, we have a warrant to seize all electronic devices, financial records, and assets tied to Vance Capital. That includes personal cell phones and laptops. I need you to step aside, please." Olivia didn't argue. She couldn't speak. She moved mechanically, stepping against the glass railing to let the agents into the master suite. She watched from the hallway as they unplugged her laptop, the very machine she had used to draft that pathetic, desperate email to Daniel just days ago. She watched them open the walk-in closet, pulling out the velvet jewelry boxes containing the diamond tennis bracelet and the sapphire earrings Mark had bought her to apologize for his volatile tempers. It was all evidence. The wealth, the status, the high society armor she had worn to justify leaving a good man in the dead of night. It was nothing but stolen money and federal exhibits. Down in the foyer, the front door opened, and Mark was escorted out into the freezing rain. The flashing lights illuminated the manicured lawn, highlighting a small cluster of local news vans that had already received the tip. Cameras flashed, capturing the humiliating exit of Seattle's fallen elite. Suddenly, the smart watch on Olivia's wrist vibrated. She looked down at the small screen. It was an automated email from the Vanguard PR Executive Board. Subject: immediate termination of partnership. There was no severance offer. There was no graceful exit. The board was amputating a diseased limb before the infection of Mark's scandal could spread to the agency. In the span of 20 minutes, she had lost her husband, her assets, her career, and her social standing. Olivia slid slowly down the glass railing, her knees finally giving out, until she was sitting on the cold hardwood steps. 5 years ago, Daniel had left her in complete silence, walking into the rain with nothing but a duffel bag and his dignity perfectly intact. Today, Mark had taken everything, leaving her surrounded by the deafening noise of sirens, entirely exposed and profoundly alone. She pulled her knees to her chest, burying her face in the cashmere, and for the first time in 5 years, she wept for the quiet, decent life she had willingly set on fire. The emotional goal of this scene is to capture the melancholic, heavy reality of absolute finality. The immediate conflict is an intensely quiet dialogue in a worn Capitol Hill diner, where a shattered Olivia attempts to offer a genuine apology to Daniel without the armor of her former wealth or status. Her dilemma is exposing her complete ruin, begging for absolution from the man she destroyed, knowing she has nothing left to leverage. The stakes are entirely psychological. She seeks a release from her crushing guilt, but Daniel must decide whether to grant her peace, solidifying the boundary that their shared history is permanently, irrevocably dead. 3 months had passed since the morning the federal windbreakers swarmed the marble foyer. The ensuing media spectacle had been swift, brutal, and entirely merciless. Mark was sitting in a federal holding facility awaiting a high-profile fraud trial, and the bankruptcy courts had systematically stripped away everything else. Olivia sat in the corner booth of a 24-hour diner on Capitol Hill. It smelled of bleached floors, old cooking grease, and damp wool. The vinyl upholstery beneath her was cracked, held together by strips of faded duct tape. Outside, the perpetual Seattle rain drummed against the fogged glass, distorting the streetlights into blurred, glowing halos. She wrapped both hands around a thick ceramic mug of black drip coffee. Her fingernails were bare, filed short. She wore a simple, faded gray sweater, one of the few practical items she had been allowed to pack into a suitcase before vacating the foreclosed mansion. She was currently living in a cramped, noisy studio apartment above a dry cleaner, navigating a reality she hadn't known since she was a struggling college student. The bell above the diner's glass door chimed, cutting through the low hum of the refrigerators. Daniel walked in. He wore a dark navy raincoat over a charcoal sweater, shaking the water from his umbrella before collapsing it. He scanned the narrow aisle, his eyes locking onto her booth. He didn't hesitate. He walked over and slid into the vinyl seat across from her. He looked exactly as he had 5 years ago, yet entirely different. The fundamental architecture of his face was the same, but the quiet anxiety, the constant, accommodating softness that she had so cruelly exploited, was gone. He was anchored. He was a man who belonged entirely to himself. "Thank you for coming," Olivia whispered. Her voice was thin, raspy from weeks of crying in an empty apartment. "I know I don't deserve the 10 minutes." "You don't," Daniel agreed softly. It wasn't an insult. It was merely a statement of fact, delivered without a trace of malice. He didn't order anything. He simply folded his hands on the scratched Formica table, waiting. Olivia looked down at her coffee. The PR executive who could spin any disaster into a victory was dead. There were no corporate buzzwords left, no strategic angles to play. "I don't want anything from you," she started, the words tumbling out, fractured and raw. "I don't want money. I don't want a recommendation. I am entirely ruined, Daniel, and I know it is exactly what I deserve. I needed to look at you. I needed to say that I am sorry." She finally raised her eyes, meeting his steady gaze. The tears broke free, tracing hot, silent lines down her pale cheeks. "I am so incredibly sorry," she choked out, her shoulders trembling under the cheap gray wool. "For the iPad," For the lies. For letting you bake that tart while I sat there and laughed with him. I traded a good, real man for a ghost. And I threw away the only genuine love I ever had because I was too greedy, too hollow to recognize it. The diner was quiet, save for the clatter of a waitress clearing dishes 3 booths down. Daniel watched her cry. He didn't reach across the table. He didn't offer a napkin. He simply sat in the heavy, agonizing silence, absorbing the confession of the woman who had once been the center of his universe. I spent 5 years in a windowless room in California, Daniel finally said, his voice a low, steady rumble over the sound of the rain. I barely slept. I worked until my hands bled because I was convinced that if I could just build something massive, something undeniably successful, it would prove that I wasn't worthless, that I wasn't something easily discarded in the middle of the night. Olivia squeezed her eyes shut, a soft, pathetic sob escaping her throat. But I realized something a few years ago, Daniel continued, the absolute calm in his tone infinitely more devastating than anger. It was never about my worth, Olivia. It was about your hunger. An empty vessel can never be filled, no matter how much you pour into it. I could have given you the world, and you still would have looked over my shoulder for something shinier. He unclasped his hands and placed them flat on the table. He looked at her, not with pity, but with a profound, quiet release. I forgive you, he said. Olivia's breath hitched. Her eyes flew open, a desperate, frantic flicker of hope igniting in her chest. But forgiveness is not an invitation, Daniel added immediately, extinguishing the spark before it could catch. His voice was gentle, but the boundary he laid down was made of solid steel. It is an exit. I am leaving the resentment here, on this table. I am letting it go, but I am not taking you with me. You have to carry the rest of this yourself. Daniel stood up. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a crisp $5 bill, and laid it next to her coffee mug to cover the check. Goodbye, Olivia. Truly. He turned and walked down the narrow aisle, pushing open the glass door and stepping out into the cold, wet Seattle night. He didn't look back. Olivia remained entirely still in the cracked vinyl booth, staring at the $5 bill, finally understanding that true closure didn't bring comfort. It only brought the terrifying, deafening silence of a completely empty room. The emotional goal of this final act is to establish the profound, quiet victory of moving forward and building a genuine life from the ashes of betrayal. The immediate conflict is resolved, leaving a stark contrast between Daniel's secured future and Olivia's permanent exile in her own consequences. The stakes reflect the ultimate payoff. Daniel and Clara share a grounded, loving reality, proving that true wealth lies in character, while Olivia is left alone to sit with the heavy silence of her irreparable loss. Set against the clearing Seattle skyline, Daniel returns to the warmth of his new home, closing the door on the past forever. The heavy glass door of the diner swung shut behind Daniel, cutting off the harsh fluorescent lighting and the smell of stale coffee. He stepped out onto the wet pavement of Capitol Hill. For the first time in weeks, the relentless Seattle rain had softened into a fine, barely perceptible mist. He walked down the sloping street toward where his car was parked, his footsteps steady and unhurried. He didn't feel a sudden, euphoric rush of triumph. There was no cinematic score playing in his head, no grand vindication. Instead, what settled into his chest was a profound, expansive lightness. The ghost that had followed him from a dark kitchen 5 years ago, the lingering, corrosive question of his own worth, had finally evaporated. He had looked at the woman who broke him, and he had felt nothing but a quiet, distant pity. The ledger was closed. 20 minutes later, the private elevator opened directly into the penthouse of his downtown residence. The space was nothing like the cold, ostentatious mansion Mark and Olivia had curated. It was warm, lined with rich walnut bookshelves, oversized woven rugs, and walls adorned with the evocative, textured landscape paintings Clara so deeply loved. The subtle scent of cedar and roasting garlic drifted from the open kitchen. Clara was standing at the island, wearing one of his oversized gray sweaters, her dark hair pinned up loosely with a wooden clip. She was reading over a thick stack of gallery exhibition proposals, a pencil tucked casually behind her ear, while occasionally stirring a simmering pot on the stove. Daniel stood in the entryway for a long moment, simply watching her. This was the life he had built. It wasn't forged in spite or designed as an act of revenge. It was built in the relentless pursuit of something undeniably real. Clara looked up, sensing his presence. Her eyes, always so incredibly perceptive, scanned his face as he took off his damp raincoat. She didn't ask a barrage of anxious questions. She knew exactly where he had been. She knew the heavy burden of the meeting he had agreed to attend. "How is the rain out there?" she asked softly, setting her pencil down on the marble counter. "It's clearing up," Daniel replied. He walked across the hardwood floor, closing the distance between them. When he reached the kitchen island, he didn't stop to look at her papers or check his phone. He simply wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her gently against his chest. Clara leaned into him immediately, her hands resting flat against his back, anchoring him in the quiet warmth of their shared space. He rested his chin in the soft crook of her neck, inhaling the faint scent of jasmine and the comfortable, domestic reality they had created together. The erratic, agonizing pulse of his past was entirely gone, replaced by the steady, even rhythm of Clara's breathing. "Are you okay?" she murmured, her thumb tracing a slow, soothing circle between his shoulder blades. "I am," Daniel said, and for the first time in a very long time, the words carried absolutely no weight. "It's entirely over." He pulled back slightly to look at her, capturing her face in his hands. He kissed her forehead, a gentle, deliberate promise of the years they still had ahead of them. Miles away, across the damp city, Olivia still sat in the corner booth of the worn Capitol Hill diner. Her coffee had gone entirely cold. The crisp $5 bill remained untouched on the scratched Formica table. The waitress had stopped checking on her. She stared out the fogged window at the blur of passing headlights, trapped in a prison constructed entirely of her own choices. She had chased an illusion of power, only to realize too late that she had traded away the only man who had ever offered her true sanctuary. But back in the penthouse, Daniel turned his back to the floor-to-ceiling windows and the glittering, rain-slicked city below. He picked up Clara's pencil, asked about the exhibition she was curating, and leaned over the counter to look at her notes. The storm had finally passed, and inside, the light was steady, unbreakable, and perfectly clear.